Janet would later remember this night by the way hope tasted right before it turned to ash. Sweet, bright, foolish. The music was still playing when her heart broke. Laughter drifted through the apartment she had spent weeks preparing. Warm lights, soft gold ribbons, candles she had chosen carefully because Mason once said he liked elegant things. Friends filled the room, glasses clinked, someone shouted her name, and for one fragile moment, Janet believed this was it. Her 25th birthday. 5 years together. Tonight was supposed to end with a ring. She kept touching her bare left hand, as if her body already knew something beautiful was coming. Mason had been distant all evening, slipping in and out of conversations, checking his phone too often, but Janet told herself it was nerves. Men got nervous before proposals. That was normal. That was romantic. She was smiling when he touched her elbow. "Janet," Mason said quietly, "can we talk? Somewhere private." Her heart leapt. This is it. She followed him into the hallway, the noise dimming behind them, the door clicking shut like the snap of a trap. Mason didn't kneel. He didn't smile. He sighed, long and heavy, as though she were the burden. "I'm leaving," he said. The word hit her wrong. Not "I need air." Not "let's step outside." Leaving sounded permanent. Ugly. "Leaving where?" she asked, laughing softly, because surely this was some elaborate surprise. "London," he said. "Tonight." The laugh died in her throat. "My family has an emergency," he continued, rubbing his temple. "I didn't want to do this here, but it's better to be honest." Honest. That word would haunt her. Janet stared at him, waiting for the rest. The reassurance, the "I'll be back," the promise that this wasn't the end of everything she'd built her life around. It never came. "What about us?" she asked. "What about—" Her voice dropped. "Tonight?" Mason finally looked at her then, and something cold settled behind his eyes. Not guilt, not sadness, evaluation. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said carefully, "about my future, my goals, the kind of life I want." Her chest tightened. "And I realized," he exhaled, "you don't fit into it anymore." The hallway seemed to tilt. "I don't fit," she repeated. He nodded, as if explaining a business decision. "You're kind, Janet. You are. But you're small. Your dreams are small. Charity work, special needs kids, pouring yourself into people who'll never give anything back." Each word landed like a slap. "I need more," he continued. "More ambition, more polish, someone who understands the circles I'm moving into now." The implication was clear. She wasn't enough. "So this is it," she whispered. 5 years and you leave on my birthday." He shrugged, actually shrugged. "I didn't plan the timing," he said, "but dragging it out would have been cruel." Cruel. Janet felt something inside her crack. Quietly, completely. "Take care of yourself," Mason added, already stepping away. "I hope you find happiness in your own way." Then he walked back into the party, grabbed his coat, and disappeared, leaving behind music, balloons, and a woman who could no longer breathe. She didn't cry that night. Not when her friends noticed he was gone. Not when they sang awkwardly around the cake. Not even when she lay alone in bed, staring at the empty space beside her. She told herself emergencies happened. She told herself love waited. 2 weeks later, the truth found her anyway. Janet was scrolling mindlessly one morning, sipping cold coffee before heading to the center, when the headline froze her fingers. Mid-swipe. Mason Hawthorne weds heiress Vivian Crown in lavish London ceremony. Her vision tunneled. There he was, smiling broadly in a tailored suit. And beside him, draped in white silk and diamonds, was Vivian Crown. Model, socialite, old money, no emergency, no delay, no Janet. The article gushed about power couples and elite unions, about how perfectly matched they were. Janet set the phone down slowly. The pain came in waves then. Violent, breath-stealing, but beneath it was something sharper. Clarity. Mason hadn't left because he had to. He left because he looked at her and decided she was not worth taking with him. That realization hurt more than the betrayal, and as Janet sat there, heart shattered but eyes finally open, she made a promise of her own. Quiet, fierce, unbreakable. She would never beg to be chosen again. If love ever came back into her life, it would have to meet her where she stood. And if it never did, she would still build something that mattered, even if it broke every fairy tale she once believed in. The first child Janet held after Mason left her did not know her heart was broken. He was 5 years old, small for his age, with wide brown eyes that didn't quite meet hers and fingers that twisted nervously at the hem of his shirt. The room was loud, too loud for him, and he rocked gently, humming under his breath to keep the world from swallowing him whole. Janet knelt anyway. She always knelt. She had learned long ago that power was never found standing over someone. "It's okay," she said softly, keeping her voice low and steady. "You're safe here." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She sat beside him on the mat, cross-legged, letting the silence stretch. No expectations. No pressure. Just presence. When his rocking slowed, when his humming softened, something inside Janet loosened with it. This, she realized, was why she kept going. Not because it was easy, because it mattered. The center became her refuge in the weeks that followed. While the world whispered about Mason Hawthorne's glittering new wife, Janet learned the rhythms of children who communicated in touches and gestures, in careful routines and quiet trust. She learned how to read their moods by the way they held their hands, how to calm storms with patience instead of force. She worked longer hours, took fewer breaks, poured every fragment of herself into them because they asked for nothing but consistency and gave her something priceless in return. They didn't see her as disposable. They saw her as safe. At night, exhaustion replaced heartbreak. Sleep came without dreams. And when loneliness crept in, she reminded herself that she had chosen this life. Simple, purposeful, unadorned. No parties, no diamonds, just meaning. Her mother worried, of course. "Baby, you don't have to be strong all the time," she said one evening, sitting across from Janet at the small kitchen table. The apartment smelled of stew and rosemary, familiar and grounding. "It's okay to grieve." Janet stared into her cup of tea. "I am grieving," she said quietly. "I just can't afford to fall apart." Her mother reached across the table, warm fingers closing over hers. "You were never inadequate," she said firmly. "Any man who made you feel that way was blind." Janet swallowed. "He didn't want the life I wanted," she said. "And that's fine. I just won't chase anyone else's version of success again." A smile curved her mother's lips. Sad, proud, knowing. That's my girl. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Mornings at the center, afternoons fundraising, grant applications, endless meetings with donors who wanted results without involvement. Janet learned to speak their language without losing herself. Clear, calm, unyielding. She learned that compassion could be strategic, that kindness did not mean weakness. Her clothes remained modest, her apartment small, her wants few, but her work grew. Parents began to seek her out specifically. Volunteers followed her lead. Children who once hid in corners now reached for her hand without fear. The center flourished in ways no spreadsheet could fully capture, and Janet, quiet Janet, overlooked Janet, became its backbone. She stopped checking Mason's social media, stopped measuring her worth against a life she was never meant to live. She chose herself every day, even when it hurt, even when it was lonely. Fairy tales were for people who believed in being rescued. Janet believed in building. And somewhere in the world, far beyond her careful routines and self-made peace, fate was already turning, patient and predatory, waiting for the woman who thought she no longer needed anyone. She had no idea that her resolve had just made her irresistible. Janet almost didn't attend the gala. She stood in her bedroom staring at the simple navy dress laid across her bed, fingers hovering as if touching it might somehow make her feel ready. The invitation had arrived, embossed in gold, heavy with prestige and expectation, everything she usually avoided. "Go," her mother had said, fastening the delicate necklace around Janet's neck with decisive hands. "Tonight isn't about them, it's about what you've built." So Janet went. The ballroom was all crystal light and polished ambition. Silk gowns whispered across marble floors. Men spoke in measured tones about mergers and markets, their laughter sharp and practiced. Janet felt out of place immediately, not because she wasn't worthy, but because she had never learned how to pretend. She kept her spine straight anyway. When her name was called, the room quieted. For her unwavering dedication to children with special needs, for building impact where others saw inconvenience, and for redefining what leadership looks like. Please welcome Janet Collins. Applause rose around her, polite at first, then sincere. Janet walked to the stage with steady steps, pulse racing, heart full. She accepted the award with hands that had soothed tantrums, signed grant requests at midnight, and wiped tears no one else had noticed. "This work," she said into the microphone, voice calm, "isn't about recognition. It's about showing up every day for people who are too often forgotten. Thank you for seeing them." She didn't embellish. She didn't perform. She spoke truth. And then she stepped down. From the shadows near the back of the room, Jaxon Reed watched her with the stillness of a predator assessing unfamiliar terrain. He did not clap. He rarely did. CEO of Reed Holdings, billionaire shipping magnate, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and quiet fear in negotiations. Jaxon was known for precision, discipline, and an almost surgical detachment from unnecessary emotion, especially where women were concerned. No scandals, no mistresses, no tabloid drama. Control was his currency, and Janet Collins disrupted it. He had noticed her long before the award, noticed how she listened more than she spoke, how she knelt to speak to a child earlier instead of brushing past him for photographs. He'd seen donors angle for her attention and leave the conversation strangely subdued, as if they'd been reminded of something inconveniently human. She was not dazzled. She was not hunting, and that made her dangerous. "Who is she?" Jaxon asked quietly. His security chief, Marcus Hale, leaned in. "Janet Collins, director of a non-profit center on the East Side. Clean reputation, no scandals. Modest finances, strong donor retention." Jackson's amber eyes remained fixed on Janet as she accepted congratulations with gentle smiles and firm boundaries. "She's not playing the room," he said. "No," Marcus agreed. "She doesn't need to." That was the problem. Jaxon had long ago decided that emotional entanglements were liabilities. Women wanted things. Status, indulgence, permanence he had no interest in offering. He had structured his life to avoid exactly that. And yet, there was something about Janet's stillness that commanded attention without asking for it, something unyielding beneath her softness. She had been broken once. Jaxon could see it in the way she guarded her space. But she hadn't diminished. She had sharpened. "Run a full background check," Jaxon said. Marcus paused. "Business or personal?" Jackson's jaw tightened slightly. "Strategic." As Janet left the stage, a ward tucked carefully under her arm, she felt the strange sensation of being watched, not leered at, not appraised, but studied. She didn't look back. She had no idea that somewhere in the quiet calculations of a man who ruled oceans and packs alike, she had just become the prize worth pursuing, Not for beauty, not for prestige, but because she was exactly what he had been waiting for, whether she knew it or not. Janet knew the building was expensive before she ever stepped inside. Reed Holdings rose from the city like a declaration, steel and glass, precise and unforgiving. The lobby was quiet in the way only places of power were quiet, where voices lowered automatically and no one lingered without purpose. She adjusted the strap of her bag and followed the assistant to the private elevator, nerves humming beneath her calm exterior. This is just a meeting, she told herself. A donor. Another conversation about funding and outcomes. The elevator doors opened directly into an office that stole the breath from her lungs. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a conquered territory. Dark wood, sharp lines, controlled minimalism. Everything here spoke of dominance, not arrogance, but ownership. And at the center of it stood Jaxon Reed. He turned as she entered. The air shifted. Janet felt it instantly, an invisible pressure that rolled over her skin, heavy and warm, like stepping into a storm's path. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence so complete it seemed to occupy the entire room. His suit was perfectly tailored, dark charcoal against powerful lines of muscle that no amount of luxury could soften. But it was his eyes that pinned her in place. Amber. Not brown, not gold. Amber, sharp and luminous, assessing her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. Something unfamiliar coiled low in her stomach. Unease laced with an instinct she didn't have a name for. Predator. Janet forced herself to breathe. "Miss Collins," he said, voice deep, measured. No warmth. No pretense. "Thank you for coming." He didn't offer a handshake. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk instead. She sat, spine straight, hands folded carefully in her lap. "Your assistant said this was about the gala." "It was," Jaxon replied, already moving. He took his seat, movements controlled, deliberate. "And about your work." Relief flickered, quickly extinguished. "I don't waste time on small talk," he continued. "So I'll be direct." Janet blinked. "All right. I'm looking for a wife." The words landed like a physical blow. Janet stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry," she said. Jaxon reached into a drawer and removed a thin folder, setting it on the desk between them with precise care. A strategic partnership, mutually beneficial. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "This isn't funny," she said quietly. "I'm not joking." The scent hit her then. Clean, masculine, something wild beneath the polish. It shouldn't have affected her. It had no right to, and yet her senses felt heightened, her body hyper-aware of his proximity. "Mr. Reed," she began. "Jaxon," he corrected automatically, then continued without pause. "You need funding, sustainable funding. Your center has potential, but passion alone won't keep it alive long-term." Her jaw tightened. "My work is not for sale." "Good," he said. "Neither am I." He slid the folder toward her. Janet hesitated before opening it. The contract inside was thorough, clinical, cold, pages of legal language outlining expectations, benefits, boundaries, marriage of convenience, public appearances, philanthropic alignment. Her breath caught. "This is insane," she said, flipping pages. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Jaxon replied. "You don't chase status. You don't exploit suffering for optics. You've been hurt, and you didn't become small because of it." Her fingers stilled. "That's not information a background check gives you," she said softly. His gaze sharpened. "No." She closed the folder slowly. "Why me?" Jaxon leaned back, studying her as if recalibrating a calculation. "Because I need stability without drama," he said, "and you need resources without strings attached." "That's a lie," Janet said. There are always strings. Yes, he agreed calmly. Mine are clear, she swallowed. And what exactly are you? For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not hesitation, but intent. I am a wolf shifter, Jaxon said evenly. An alpha. And if you're considering this, you deserve transparency. The room went very still. Janet's world tilted. Myths, legends, bedtime warnings whispered by frightened parents. She stood abruptly, chair scraping softly against the floor. You expect me to believe that? Jaxon rose as well, and the pressure in the room intensified. Instinctive, overwhelming. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up, heart racing, nerves singing. I'm not asking for belief, he said. I'm offering truth. He slid a final page toward her. No marking, he continued. No forced bond, separate rooms, no pack obligations unless you choose otherwise. Janet stared at the contract, at the future it promised and the fear it ignited. She had sworn never to be chosen again, and yet here she was, standing before a man who didn't want her for love, but for alignment. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the folder. This changes everything, she whispered. Jackson's voice was low, unwavering. It will change lives, he corrected. And for the first time since Mason left her in a hallway full of broken promises, Janet realized she was standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than heartbreak. Janet did not sleep. The contract lay open on her kitchen table, its pages spread like a map to a life she had never imagined choosing. The city outside her window hummed with late-night traffic, ordinary and indifferent, as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis the moment Jaxon Reed said the word alpha. Wolf shifter. Her eyes traced the letters again, as though repetition might strip them of their weight. Separate residence clauses, public marriage stipulations, funding guarantees, endless, almost obscene numbers that could build classrooms, hire specialists, expand care to children she'd had to turn away with apologies lodged in her throat. And then there were the other sections. Pack hierarchy acknowledgement, confidentiality regarding supernatural status, optional participation in rituals she didn't yet understand. Janet closed her eyes. She had grown up with the stories, warnings dressed as folklore. Creatures who wore human faces, bonds that erased choice, power that swallowed the weak. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was teeth and claws and instincts older than law. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from the center. Another child waitlisted. Another family told not yet. Janet stared at the screen, chest tight. How many times had she stood in front of parents and wished she had more to give? How many nights had she cried quietly because love alone didn't pay therapists or build safe spaces? She pushed back from the table and paced the small apartment, bare feet whispering against the floor. Jaxon had been honest, brutally so. No promises of romance, no illusions of rescue, just a partnership, a choice. Her mother's door creaked open. I heard you moving, she said gently, stepping into the kitchen in her robe. Her gaze went straight to the contract. That must be him. Janet nodded, throat tight. He wants to marry me. Her mother didn't gasp, didn't laugh. She pulled out a chair and sat. He's not human, Janet added. Her mother's brow lifted slightly. Is he dangerous? Janet thought of amber eyes, of control honed to a razor's edge, of a presence that felt like standing in the path of something powerful, but contained. I don't think so, she said honestly. I think he's disciplined. Her mother reached across the table, fingers warm and steady. Then what scares you? Janet swallowed. That it's real, that it's bigger than me, that I'll lose myself. Her mother squeezed her hand. You've never lost yourself to anything. Baby, you give, but you don't disappear. Janet looked down at the pages again. "This could change everything," she whispered. "For the kids. For families who don't have options." Her mother nodded slowly. "Then do what you've always done." "What's that?" "Choose purpose over fear," she said. "Do what's best for your mission. The rest you'll handle." Silence settled between them, not heavy, but thoughtful. Janet exhaled, long and slow. She had been abandoned once for being inadequate. She had rebuilt herself without bitterness, without blame. This wasn't about being chosen. This was about choosing. She gathered the pages into a neat stack, her hands steady now. If she was going to step into a world of wolves and alphas and power she barely understood, she would do it on her terms. For the children, for the future, for herself. And somewhere across the city, Jaxon Reed felt an unfamiliar tension coil low in his chest, an instinct stirring, ancient and alert. Because the woman he had offered a contract to was about to change his life in ways no strategy could predict. Janet returned to Reed Holdings with the contract. The building felt different this time, less intimidating. Or perhaps she was steadier. She was shown into the same office, the same commanding space of glass and steel. Jaxon stood by the window when she entered, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed on the city below, as if measuring distances only he could see. He turned the moment the door closed. The pressure came again, subtle but unmistakable, but this time Janet didn't flinch. She held his gaze, meeting Amber with resolve. "You read everything," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." "And you still came back?" "Yes." Something eased in his posture, almost imperceptible but real. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair. She did. Jaxon didn't reach for the contract immediately. Instead, he folded his hands on the desk, eyes steady, voice calm. "There are things you should understand before you sign," he said. "Not as legal terms, as truth." Janet nodded. "I'd prefer that." "I am an alpha," he began. "That means dominance is instinctive, not chosen. It affects space, presence, authority. You may feel it even when I'm not trying to project it." She exhaled slowly. "I felt it." A corner of his mouth twitched. "I assumed you would." "I want to be clear," he continued. "I will not mark you." Janet's breath caught. "In my world," Jaxon said, "a mark is permanent. It creates a mate bond that overrides choice, emotion, even fear. I will not force that on you." Her fingers curled slightly in her lap. "Even if we're married?" "Especially because we're married," he replied. "Consent matters." The words settled deep. "And the living arrangements?" she asked. "Separate rooms," he said without hesitation. "Your privacy will be respected. No expectations of intimacy. Public appearances only when necessary. This is a partnership, not a cage." She studied him, this man of power and restraint, offering her control instead of conquest. "You're very particular," she said. "It's how I survive," he answered simply. Janet placed the contract on the desk between them. "And the foundation?" "Fully funded," he said. "Endowed. Protected. You will have autonomy. I won't interfere unless you ask." Silence stretched. Then Janet reached for the pen. Her signature was firm. Jaxon's followed immediately, precise and decisive. The sound of ink scratching paper echoed like a final heartbeat. "It will be a small ceremony," he said once the papers were signed. 3 days. Quiet. My pack leadership will attend. Your family, of course. "That's it?" Janet asked. "That's all that's required," he replied. "This isn't theater." She nodded. "I don't want theater." Their eyes met again, something unspoken passing between them. Respect, recognition, not desire. Not yet. As Janet stood to leave, Jaxon said, You're making a rational choice. She paused at the door. So are you. His gaze followed her until she was gone. 3 days. That was all it would take to bind their lives in name only. Neither of them realized that no contract in the world could contain what was already beginning to wake between them. The wedding was nothing like the ones Janet had imagined as a girl. There were no flowers arching toward the sky, no crowds murmuring with expectation, no music swelling to announce destiny. There was only quiet. The ceremony took place at dawn in a private hall tucked deep within the Reed estate grounds, a place that felt less like a chapel and more like neutral territory. Stone floors, high ceilings, windows that let in pale morning light, sharp and honest. Janet stood beside her mother, hands clasped, wearing a simple ivory dress that flowed instead of clung. No veil, no illusion. Across from her stood Jaxon Reed. He wore black, tailored, severe, immaculate. Power radiated from him without effort, an undercurrent that made the air feel charged. The alpha wasn't on display, but it was present, coiled and watchful. Around them stood members of his pack. They did not smile. Janet felt their gazes immediately, assessing, measuring, searching for weakness. Men and women alike, some elegant, some fierce, all bound together by something deeper than loyalty. Instinct. She lifted her chin anyway. If they expected her to shrink, they would be disappointed. The officiant spoke in low, formal tones, words that blended human legality with ancient tradition. When Jaxon spoke his vows, his voice was steady, unembellished. I vow protection, he said, respect and choice. No promises of forever love, just truth. Janet's turn came. I vow honesty, she said, commitment to what we've agreed, and to walk this path without fear. Jaxon's eyes flickered, briefly, intensely, as if something in her words struck deeper than intended. The ring he slid onto her finger was heavy, cool, unmistakably real. By law and by witness, the officiant said, you are bound. Bound. The word echoed louder than any cheer. There was no kiss, just a nod, a mutual understanding. Mrs. Reed. The drive to the main estate was silent. The property revealed itself slowly, iron gates, sweeping grounds, a mansion that felt less like a home and more like a seat of command. Janet took it in without awe. She had learned that size did not equal worth. Inside, staff moved quietly, efficiently, acknowledging Jaxon with subtle bows of respect, and Janet with cautious curiosity. She was shown to her wing, not a room, a wing, a bedroom larger than her entire apartment, a sitting area, a private bath clad in marble, windows overlooking manicured gardens she doubted anyone truly played in. Luxury without warmth. This is yours, Jaxon said, standing just inside the doorway. He did not cross the threshold. You won't be disturbed. She nodded. Thank you. Silence stretched between them, thick, expectant. You'll find my rooms are on the opposite side of the estate, he added. If you need anything, my staff answers to you. And you? She asked quietly. Something unreadable crossed his face. I answer to myself, he said. Then he stepped back. The door closed softly behind him. Janet stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the echo of her own heartbeat. She was married. To an alpha. To a man who had sworn restraint instead of possession. That night, as she lay in unfamiliar silk sheets, she felt it again. That subtle pressure in the air. The awareness of another presence under the same roof. Not touching, not claiming, just there. And somewhere across the estate, Jaxon Reed stood at his window, jaw tight, instincts restless, realizing that for the first time in his life, control was going to be tested. The jet was quiet in the way only wealth could afford. Janet sat by the window, hands folded in her lap, watching the clouds slide beneath them like unclaimed territory. Everything about this trip felt unreal. The private flight, the discreet security detail, the effortless way Jaxon moved through spaces designed to obey him. London. Her chest tightened at the name. High society had never been kind to women who didn't know how to play its games. She had learned that lesson once already, painfully. Jaxon noticed. He always noticed. "You don't have to speak unless you want to," he said calmly from the seat beside her. He wasn't looking at her, but his attention was unmistakable. "Stand on my left. If you're uncomfortable, say so. We'll leave." She turned toward him, surprised. "Just like that?" "Yes. No explanation. I don't explain my decisions to people who aren't affected by them," he replied. Then, after a pause, "You are affected." Something warm and unfamiliar settled in her chest. The event was held in a restored historical venue overlooking the Thames. Golden lights, polished accents, and an air thick with exclusivity. As they stepped inside, the attention was immediate. Whispers followed them like shadows. Janet felt her spine stiffen, her pulse quicken. Jaxon's hand came to rest at the small of her back, light, deliberate. Not a claim, a signal. "I'm here." He guided her through the room with quiet authority, introducing her without flourish. "My wife, Janet Reed." The words landed with weight. Not philanthropist, not accessory. Wife. She met curious gazes with steady composure. Shaking hands, answering polite questions without oversharing. Jaxon remained close, his presence a steady anchor amid the glittering scrutiny. When someone addressed him directly and ignored her, Jaxon corrected them immediately. "You should speak to us," he said coolly. No smile, no apology. Respect followed. Janet watched him with new eyes, not as a strategist, but as a protector who wielded his power with precision rather than force. For the first time, she felt what it was like to stand beside someone instead of behind them, and as the night wore on, she realized something else too. She wasn't invisible here. She was chosen, not for spectacle, but for substance. And somewhere deep beneath Jaxon's composed exterior, instinct stirred, recognizing that his careful restraint was no longer just discipline. It was becoming devotion. Janet felt him before she saw him. That old, familiar tightening in her chest. The instinct to brace, to shrink. She was standing near the edge of the ballroom, one hand wrapped around a flute of champagne she hadn't tasted, when the air shifted behind her. Sharp, intrusive, unwelcome. "Well," a voice drawled, "if it isn't Charity Case Janet." Her fingers went cold. She turned slowly. Mason Hawthorne stood there in a tailored suit that screamed old money and borrowed confidence, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a smile sharpened by cruelty. Time had polished him, but not improved him. His eyes still held the same calculating disdain, the same belief that the world existed to validate his choices. "So this is where you ended up," he continued, gaze sweeping her from head to toe. "Floating around galas, playing savior." Janet lifted her chin. "Good evening, Mason." Vivian was nowhere in sight. He smirked at the absence of a ring he assumed wasn't there. "Let me guess. Still unmarried. Still waiting for the world to notice how noble you are." Her pulse thundered, but she didn't look away. "I'm happy," she said simply. Mason laughed softly. "You always were good at convincing yourself of that." The words cut, but before they could land fully, the world shifted. Heat, pressure, power. An arm slid around her waist, solid, unyielding, impossibly grounding. Janet inhaled sharply as Jaxon stepped into her space, his presence crashing over the moment like a tidal wave. The scent of him, clean, wild, unmistakably alpha, wrapped around her senses. His hand rested possessively at her hip. Not performative, instinctive. Janet felt it echo through her bones. "Is there a problem?" Jaxon asked calmly. Mason's smirk faltered. He looked Jaxon up and down, recognition dawning too late. "And you are." Jackson's grip tightened just enough to be unmistakable. Her husband. Silence slammed into the space between them. Janet lifted her left hand. The diamond caught the light. Brilliant. Undeniable. Mason's face drained of color. Before he could recover, Jaxon leaned down and kissed her. Not gentle, not restrained. The kiss was deep, claiming, earth-shattering, his dominance flaring without apology. Janet gasped softly against his mouth as heat flooded her veins, instinct and emotion colliding in a way that stole her breath. For one suspended heartbeat, nothing existed but him. Then he pulled back, resting his forehead briefly against hers, an intimate, possessive gesture that made the message unmistakable. "Mine." Jaxon turned his gaze back to Mason, his voice smooth as a blade sliding free. "I believe you were assessing my wife," he said. "Careful. You lack the credentials." Mason swallowed. "I didn't realize—" "No," Jaxon agreed. "You didn't." He looked Mason over with deliberate disinterest. "I'm familiar with your work. Or rather, your reliance on other people's assets." Mason stiffened. "Vivian's portfolio is impressive," Jaxon continued mildly. "Fragile, but impressive. You might consider being more discreet. Public miscalculations have consequences." The threat was subtle. Lethal. Mason opened his mouth, then closed it again. Janet felt Jackson's thumb brush reassuring circles against her side, anchoring her as the moment collapsed in on itself. "You're dismissed," Jaxon said quietly. Mason stepped back, humiliation burning bright in his eyes, and disappeared into the crowd. Only when he was gone did Jaxon look down at Janet. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, then laughed softly, breathless. "I think so." His gaze lingered on her mouth for a fraction too long before he straightened, controls snapping back into place. "Good," he said, "because I don't tolerate disrespect toward what's mine." Janet's heart pounded. For the first time since Mason had walked out of her life, she didn't feel small. She felt claimed, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The suite door closed with a soft, final click. Silence flooded the space. Thick, charged, heavy with everything neither of them was saying. Janet stood near the window, the city lights of London stretching endlessly below, her reflection faint in the glass. Her lips still tingled. Her pulse hadn't slowed since the ballroom. The kiss replayed in her mind, how sudden it had been, how right. How safe she had felt in the middle of that storm of attention and judgment. Jaxon removed his jacket with deliberate precision, hanging it neatly as if routine could anchor him. His movements were controlled, but the tension beneath them was unmistakable, like a predator forcing stillness on coiled muscle. "That was effective," he said at last. Janet turned slowly. "That's one word for it." His amber eyes flicked to her mouth before he looked away. "I apologize if I crossed a boundary." She shook her head. "You didn't." He studied her carefully. "The contract still stands." There it was. The wall. Janet nodded, though something in her chest tightened. "I know." Jaxon moved toward the minibar, pouring himself a drink he didn't touch. His grip on the glass was a fraction too tight. "You were calm," he said quietly. "With him." She considered that. "I wasn't calm," she admitted. "I just wasn't afraid." He looked at her then. Really looked. "With Mason," she continued, voice soft but steady. "I spent 5 years trying to be enough, trying not to take up too much space. Loving him felt like balancing on glass. Her gaze didn't leave his. With you, it felt like standing on solid ground. The hair shifted. Jaxon set the glass down carefully. Dominance isn't meant to comfort, he said. Yours does, she replied simply. The truth of it settled between them, dangerous, undeniable. For a moment, Jaxon looked as though he might cross the room, close the distance, shatter the careful lines he'd drawn. Instead, he straightened. You should rest, he said, voice low and controlled. Tomorrow we'll be busy. Janet nodded, though disappointment flickered beneath her composure. As she moved toward her room, she paused. Thank you, she said, for seeing me. His jaw tightened. Good night, Janet. Good night, Jaxon. The door closed between them, but not before something irrevocable had shifted. Janet lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling, realizing the truth she could no longer deny. Jaxon Reed's power didn't erase her. It held her, and that terrified her far more than any fairy tale ever had. The first thing Jaxon did when they returned home was not kiss her again. He went to work. Within 48 hours, Janet's inbox transformed into something she barely recognized. Emails from architects, logistics coordinators, education consultants, legal teams specializing in non-profit protection. Grants that had once taken months of pleading were now approved with quiet efficiency. No fanfare, no press, just action. Jaxon sat across from her at the long dining table one evening, tablet in hand, reviewing reports as if he were overseeing a fleet instead of a dream. We'll expand in phases, he said. 3 new centers in underserved districts, staffing ratios adjusted, long-term endowments secured. Janet stared at the numbers, throat tight. You did all this fast? This should have been done years ago, he replied. You were just missing leverage. She laughed softly. You make it sound so simple. It is, he said, eyes lifting to hers. When the intent is clean. The first time he accompanied her to the center, he stayed near the door, observing, always observing. He watched her crouch to eye level with a nonverbal child, waiting patiently until small fingers tugged at her sleeve. Watched her laugh, really laugh, when paint splattered across her blouse. Watched the way the children gravitated toward her as if she were gravity itself. This was not performance. This was truth. Jaxon felt something inside him strain, discipline tightening against instinct. The alpha in him stirred, restless and alert, recognizing something precious and rare. She was not fragile. She was essential. When a child climbed into Janet's lap without hesitation, curling against her as if the world made sense there, Jaxon's chest ached in a way no negotiation ever had. Later, in the car, he said quietly, "They trust you completely." Janet smiled, tired and radiant. "They teach me how to be honest." He looked away, jaw tight. For the first time in his life, power felt secondary, and that realization unsettled him more than any threat ever had. The crisis began with a scream, not loud, sharp, the kind that cut through noise and laughter and routine like glass through skin. Jaxon was reviewing site plans with the logistics team when it happened. He looked up instantly, every instinct flaring, alpha awareness snapping to attention. The child was small, 6 years old, hypersensitive, overwhelmed. He had dropped his noise-canceling headphones. The room had become too bright, too loud, too much. Panic seized him completely. Staff moved instinctively to contain the situation. Janet moved to him. She knelt without hesitation, placing herself directly in his line of sight, her voice low, steady, unbreakable. "Hey," she said softly. "Look at me. Just me." The child flailed, tears streaking his face, hands clenched in distress. Janet didn't rush. She breathed slowly. exaggeratedly, letting him mirror her rhythm. One hand rested on the floor between them, open, non-threatening. The other reached for the headphones and slid them gently closer, never forcing. "It's okay to be scared," she whispered. "I'm right here. I won't leave." Minutes passed. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, the child's breathing matched hers. His hands loosened. His eyes found her face. He crawled forward and collapsed into her arms. Janet wrapped him up without triumph, without relief. Only quiet acceptance, as if this outcome had never been in doubt. Jaxon felt something inside him break. Not shatter violently, but split cleanly, deliberately. He had built his life on control, on discipline, on distance. He had chosen Janet because she was logical, clean, safe. But watching her now, anchored in chaos, unflinching, loving without demand, he understood the truth with brutal clarity. This was not strategy. This was fate. That night, the estate was silent when Jaxon crossed it. He didn't summon her. He went to her door. Janet opened it in soft sleepwear, surprise flickering across her face. "Jaxon." He stood there without armor. No jacket, no calculated calm. Just truth burning behind amber eyes. "I can't maintain this distance anymore," he said quietly. Her heart stuttered. "I didn't seek love," he continued, voice low, controlled only by effort. "It wasn't part of the plan. But I found it anyway." He looked at her as if she were the axis of his world. "I love you, Janet." The words settled between them. Heavy, irreversible, real. Janet's breath caught. She didn't answer him right away. Not because she doubted the words, but because they settled so deeply, so completely, that she needed a moment to breathe around them. "I love you." She had waited years to hear those words spoken without condition, without expectation, without the sharp edge of be more hidden behind them. Jaxon stood before her, unmoving as if bracing for impact. The alpha was still there, power coiled, instinct alert, but the man beneath it was bare in a way no one else had ever seen. "I spent so long convincing myself I didn't need this," Janet said quietly. "Protection, partnership, someone who stands instead of hovers." She reached for his hand. He stilled at the contact, then laced his fingers with hers as if anchoring himself. "With Mason," she continued, voice steady, "I was always afraid of being left, afraid of asking for too much. Loving him meant shrinking so he could feel bigger." Her gaze lifted to Jaxon's. "With you, loving you feels like being allowed to exist fully." Something in his chest loosened, something ancient and tightly bound. "You don't disappear beside me," he said. "You expand." Janet smiled softly. "That's how I knew." She took a breath, then another. "I didn't just fall for your protection, Jaxon. I fell for your restraint, your honesty, the way you gave me power instead of taking it." She reached past him and picked up the contract from her bedside table, the same pages that had once represented safety without vulnerability. "I don't want this anymore," she said gently. Jaxon stared at the document as if it no longer recognized him. "I don't want a marriage built on terms," Janet said. "I want vows that grow, choices we make every day." She placed the contract in his hands. "Do you?" The alpha in him surged, instinct roaring for permanence, for bond, for claim. But the man answered first. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I choose you, without conditions." He tore the contract cleanly in half. The sound was quiet, final. They stood there in the aftermath of it, two people who had crossed an invisible line and could never return. Jaxon cupped her face with reverent care, his thumb brushing her cheek as if memorizing her. "This doesn't mean I'll stop protecting you," he said softly. Janet smiled. "I wouldn't want you to." Their kiss this time was different from the one in the ballroom. No audience, no performance, no dominance unleashed for display. Just warmth, intention, a slow unfolding of trust. They moved together naturally, without urgency, learning the shape of each other not with hunger, but with certainty. The night held them gently as they lay side by side, breaths evening, the world outside reduced to something distant and unimportant. Janet rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady strength of his heartbeat. For the first time, she murmured, "I don't feel like I'm waiting for something to end." Jaxon pressed a kiss to her hair, his arm tightening around her, not to confine, but to shelter. "You're home," he said simply. And as sleep finally claimed them, bound not by ink or obligation, but by choice, Janet understood the truth she would carry for the rest of her life. She hadn't lost a fairy tale. She had outgrown one, and in its place she had found something far more powerful, a love that didn't ask her to be less. A vow that didn't need witnesses. A future built not on promises made too early, but on truth chosen, together. Janet thought the decision would terrify her. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a truth she had already accepted. They stood together on the terrace at dawn, the estate quiet except for bird song and the distant hush of wind through ancient trees. Jaxon rested his forearms on the stone railing, gaze fixed on the horizon, his presence calm but watchful, as if part of him already sensed what was coming. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Marriage, love, that's enough. The mark is permanent. Once the bond snaps, there's no undoing it." Janet studied him, Sam the alpha who had learned restraint, the man who had chosen her freedom before his instincts. "I know," she said. She stepped closer, slipping her hand into his. The connection between them hummed, subtle but undeniable, like a current just beneath the skin. "I'm not afraid anymore," she continued. "I've spent my life choosing others, choosing purpose. This time, I'm choosing us." Jaxon closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening, not in resistance, but reverence. "If you accept the mark," he said, voice low, "you will be Luna, my equal, my anchor. The pack will feel you. The bond will make you stronger, but it will also make you visible." Janet smiled softly. "I've been invisible before. I survived it." She lifted her gaze to his. "I want to belong, not because I need protection, but because I choose this family. I choose you." The alpha bowed his head, not to dominate, but to honor. "Then I will prepare the ceremony," he said. "And I swear, by instinct and by will, that I will never cage you." Not in a ballroom or hall, but in a stone circle nestled deep within the estate grounds, where the land itself seemed to breathe with memory. Torches flickered, casting warm light over faces both curious and guarded. This time, when Janet stepped forward beside Jaxon, the scrutiny felt different. Less judgment, more recognition. Jaxon introduced her formally, his voice carrying effortlessly through the circle. "This is Janet Reed," he said. "The woman I chose. The woman who chose me. She comes to you not as an outsider, but as my mate." A ripple passed through the pack, instinct stirring, ancient and alert. One by one, members of the hierarchy stepped forward. The beta, steady-eyed and respectful. The pack healer, whose gaze softened as she studied Janet's calm presence. Elders who had seen generations rise and fall. No one challenged her. They felt her. The ceremony was simple, but powerful. Janet stood before Jaxon, heart steady, senses already sharpening as if the world were leaning toward her in anticipation. The air was charged, humming against her skin. "Are you here of your own will?" the elder asked. "Yes," Janet answered clearly. "Do you accept the bond, knowing it will tie your life to his, heart to heart, instinct to instinct?" I do. Jaxon stepped closer, reverence etched into every line of his body. He brushed her hair aside, baring her neck. This mark is not ownership, he said softly, for her alone. It is recognition. When his teeth sank gently into her skin, pain fled, sharp, brief, and then the world exploded. Heat surged through her veins. Sound sharpened, color deepened. She felt him, not just his body, but his presence, his thoughts, his fierce, unwavering devotion. And then, snap, the bond locked into place. Janet gasped, clutching Jaxon's arms as a wave of sensation crashed over her. She could feel his heartbeat echoing inside her chest, his emotions, control, awe, love wrapped around her like a living thing. She could hear the forest breathe, feel the pack as a living network of warmth and strength. And above all, she could feel him. "Jaxon," she whispered. "I've got you," he said instantly, arms tightening around her. "You're not alone. You'll never be alone." Tears slid down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the overwhelming rightness of it. She wasn't losing herself. She was expanding. When the ceremony ended, the pack bowed, not to dominance, but to balance. "Luna," they greeted her. The word resonated through her, settling into her bones. As Jaxon led her from the circle, Janet looked back once, at the firelight, the faces. The world she had never known existed. She had crossed into legend, not as a girl rescued by an alpha, but as a woman who chose her mate, her power, and her place beside him, and the bond between them pulsed steadily, eternal and unbreakable, as if the universe itself had finally exhaled and said, "Yes." This one. The children laughed differently now, not cautiously, not as if joy were something that might be taken away. They laughed freely, bright, unafraid, echoing through wide hallways painted in warm colors and filled with light. Janet stood at the observation window of the newest center, hands folded loosely over her abdomen, watching a little girl stack blocks with fierce concentration while a therapist encouraged her gently. 5 years ago, this building had been a sketch on a notepad. Now it was one of 12. Janet Reed, Luna, philanthropist, had built a legacy with quiet precision. Her foundation spanned cities and borders, funded sustainably, protected legally, and driven by one unyielding principle: dignity before display. No child was rushed, no family was dismissed, and no donor was allowed to forget why they were there. The pack respected her, not because she was Jaxon's mate, but because she was formidable in her own right. She ruled softly, decisively, with a strength that didn't roar, but endured. Jaxon watched her from across the room, pride steady and deep. The mate bond between them pulsed warmly, not demanding attention, simply present. They were partners in the truest sense. Strategy and compassion, instinct and intention. That evening, as twilight settled over the estate, Janet sat curled beside him on the terrace, a tablet resting idly in her lap. A headline caught her eye. She almost scrolled past it. Almost. Financial scandal rocks Hawthorne Holdings, Vivian Crown, files for divorce. Janet read quietly. A reckless investment, mismanaged assets, public hearings. Vivian's fortune fractured, Mason's reputation in ruins. Photos showed him pale, defensive, no longer polished by confidence but eroded by exposure. She felt no triumph, only clarity. Jaxon glanced at her, sensing the shift through the bond. Old ghosts? She nodded once. Old lessons. She closed the article and set the tablet aside. For a moment she remembered the girl in the hallway, the one holding her breath, waiting for a ring that never came, waiting to be chosen by a man whose vision never extended beyond himself. Mason hadn't rejected her because she lacked worth. He had rejected her because he lacked vision. And that rejection, sharp and cruel as it was, had freed her path. It had led her to a man who didn't chase illusions, who didn't fear strength, who built instead of consumed. A man who saw legacy where others saw inconvenience. Janet leaned into Jackson's side, resting her head against his shoulder. "Funny," she murmured. "If he hadn't walked away, I would never have been found." Jaxon kissed her hair, his voice low and certain. "You were never lost." She smiled. The wind carried the sounds of the estate, life moving forward, secure and thriving. Somewhere, children slept safely because she had chosen purpose. Somewhere, futures were unfolding because she had dared to believe her life could be more. She had stopped believing in fairy tales. Instead, she had built a legacy, not of magic or destiny alone, but of choice, of love, of a woman once deemed inadequate by a man with no vision, who became the Luna beside an alpha who saw her worth and helped her turn it into a legacy that would outlive them both. Tell me what you think about this story, and if you enjoyed it, share your favorite moment. I always love hearing your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.